January 17, 1945, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The transport trucks rolled to a stop beneath a canopy of southern pine. Mud clung to their wheels. Steam rose from the engines in the cold morning air. Inside, 62 German soldiers sat in silence, their uniforms still crusted with the salt and grime of the Atlantic crossing. They had been told nothing, only that they were prisoners now, only that the war, for them, was over. The rear gates swung open and light flooded in, soft, pale winter light that seemed too gentle for men who had spent months in the gray bowels of a Liberty ship. They stepped down onto American soil for the first time, their boots sinking into the red clay. One man glanced up at the watchtowers. Another studied the faces of the guards, young men barely older than boys, holding rifles with a casualness that felt almost insulting. There were no dogs, no barbed wire dug into frozen ground, no emaciated figures shuffling past in the shadow of a gallows. One of the Germans, a Gefreiter named Klaus Hartmann, turned to his comrade and muttered something under his breath. The other man smirked. Then, quietly at first, they began to laugh. It was not the laughter of relief, not yet. It was the laughter of disbelief, of men who had been told again and again that America was a land of chaos and weakness, a mongrel nation on the brink of collapse. And here they stood, surrounded by abundance they could not yet comprehend, in a camp that looked more like a work colony than a prison. The laughter spread. A few more joined in, nervous, bitter, confused. They did not know it yet, but that laughter would not last.
The story of German prisoners of war in the United States is not one typically told in the grand narratives of the Second World War. It does not carry the weight of Normandy or Stalingrad. It does not echo with the thunder of Berlin's fall or the flash of Hiroshima. But it is a story that cuts to the heart of what the war was truly about. Not merely the clash of armies, but the collision of ideologies, the confrontation between two visions of what it meant to be human. By the end of 1945, the United States held more than 425,000 German POWs within its borders. They were housed in over 500 camps scattered across the country, from the cornfields of Iowa to the deserts of Arizona, from the forests of Maine to the bayous of Louisiana. These men had been pulled from the wreckage of Rommel's Afrika Korps, plucked from the hedgerows of Normandy, dragged from the frozen hills of the Ardennes. They had been soldiers of the Third Reich, believers in a vision of the world shaped by hierarchy, discipline, and the ruthless application of force. They had been told that America was soft, decadent, a nation of mixed blood and weak will, incapable of sustaining a serious war effort. And then they arrived.
The Geneva Convention of 1929 laid out strict guidelines for the treatment of prisoners of war: food, shelter, medical care, male privileges, the right to be housed in conditions comparable to those of the captor's own soldiers. The United States, a signatory, adhered to these rules with a rigor that bordered on the obsessive, not out of sentimentality, not out of kindness, but because America understood something the Third Reich did not: that the way you treat your enemies reveals more about your strength than any battlefield victory ever could. The camps were not luxurious, they were not meant to be, but they were startling in their ordinariness. Barracks built of fresh-cut pine, mess halls that served 3 hot meals a day, infirmaries staffed by trained medics, libraries stocked with books, athletic fields where men could play soccer or handball, workshops where prisoners earned 80 cents a day, paid in scrip, assembling furniture, repairing tools, or working in nearby farms. There were movie nights, church services, letters home, delivered with a regularity that many of the prisoners had not experienced even in their own army. Klaus Hartmann, the man who had laughed on that January morning, would later write to his sister in Hamburg, "I have eaten more in 3 days here than I did in 3 weeks at the front. I do not understand it, I do not trust it, but I am no longer hungry." For men who had spent years under the constant drumbeat of Nazi propaganda, who had been told that the Americans were barbaric, that Jews controlled their government, that their society was on the verge of collapse, the cognitive dissonance was profound. They had expected brutality, starvation, forced labor in conditions that mirrored the camps they themselves had guarded in occupied Europe. What they found instead was something far more dangerous to the ideology they had carried into battle. They found normalcy. They found abundance. They found a society that functioned, that fed its people, that did not require the constant application of terror to sustain itself. And slowly, painfully, the laughter began to die. April 1943, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The trains arrived in the dead of night, their boxcars crammed with men who had surrendered in Tunisia, the last remnants of the Afrika Korps. They stumbled out into the Great Plains darkness, disoriented and exhausted, their tropical uniforms absurd in the Kansas wind. The camp had been built hastily, rows of whitewashed barracks arranged in neat grids, surrounded by a single fence and a handful of sleepy guards. No machine gun nests, no searchlights cutting through the night. One of the prisoners, a lieutenant named Friedrich Bauer, surveyed the camp with a soldier's eye. He noted the distance between the fence and the nearest town. He noted the lack of security. He turned to his men and said simply, "We could walk out of here." It was true. Escapes were frequent in the early months of the camp system, though they rarely lasted long. Where would a German soldier go in the middle of Kansas? How far could he get without papers, without money, without a word of English? Most were recaptured within days, returned to the camps with little more than a reprimand. The American guards treated these escape attempts with a kind of bemused tolerance, as if they understood that the men needed to try, if only to prove to themselves that they were still soldiers. But Friedrich Bauer did not escape, not because he feared capture, but because within weeks he no longer saw the point. The work details were the first shock. Prisoners were sent out to nearby farms to harvest wheat, to pick cotton, to clear irrigation ditches. The labor was hard, but no harder than what they had endured in North Africa. What startled them was the treatment. The farmers who employed them were not cruel. They did not spit or curse. They offered water on hot days. They shared cigarettes. Some invited the prisoners to sit on their porches in the evening, to drink lemonade and listen to the radio. The language barrier meant little. Gestures sufficed. Smiles sufficed. Bauer found himself assigned to a farm owned by a man named Henry Schroeder, a second-generation German-American whose grandparents had emigrated from Bavaria in the 1880s. Schroeder spoke a rough Bavarian dialect that Bauer could just barely understand. Over the course of a summer, the two men developed a cautious rapport. Schroeder showed Bauer photographs of his sons, one in the army stationed in England, another in the Navy somewhere in the Pacific. He did not ask Bauer about the war. He did not lecture him about politics. He simply treated him like a man who had been unlucky enough to be on the wrong side of history. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink into the wheat fields, Schroeder handed Bauer a glass of beer, real beer, cold and bitter. Bauer stared at it for a long moment. In Germany, in the camps, in the propaganda he had consumed for years, this moment was supposed to be impossible. The enemy did not offer you beer. The enemy did not treat you like a human being. He drank it anyway. And when he returned to the camp that night, he said nothing to his comrades, because he did not yet have the words to explain what he was beginning to feel.
The transformation was not immediate. It could not be. These were men who had been shaped by years of indoctrination, who had fought for a cause they believed in, or had convinced themselves they believed in. The Nazi Party had infiltrated the camps just as it had infiltrated every corner of German society. Hardcore SS officers and Hitler youth leaders organized themselves into clandestine cells, intimidating fellow prisoners, enforcing loyalty, punishing those who showed signs of weakness or collaboration. There were beatings, there were murders. In some camps, prisoners who spoke favorably of their American captors were found hanged in their barracks, their deaths staged to look like suicides. The American authorities were slow to recognize the extent of the problem. It was only after a series of investigations, prompted by the brutal killing of a prisoner named Johannes Kunze at Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma in November 1943, that the camp system began to segregate the hardcore Nazis from the rest of the population. But even as the fanatics clung to their ideology, the cracks were spreading. The evidence was everywhere. In the letters prisoners received from home, describing cities reduced to rubble, families scattered or dead, the slow collapse of everything they had fought to protect. In the newsreels shown in camp theaters, footage of concentration camps liberated by Allied forces, images so horrific that many prisoners refused to believe they were real. In the quiet conversations that began to take place in barracks after lights out, men admitting to each other that they were tired, that they were lost, that they no longer knew what they had been fighting for. And in the food.
The food was the symbol that appeared again and again in the diaries, letters, and memoirs of German POWs. It was the tangible proof of something they could not deny. Every morning, breakfast, oatmeal or eggs, toast with butter, coffee with sugar. Every afternoon, lunch, stew or roast beef, potatoes, vegetables, bread. Every evening, dinner, chicken or pork, rice or beans, fruit. Calories counted and measured according to the Geneva Convention, exceeding in many cases what American soldiers received overseas. For men who had spent years on half rations, who had watched their homeland descend into starvation as the Allied blockade tightened, who had seen their own army reduced to ersatz coffee and sawdust bread, the abundance was incomprehensible. It was not just that the Americans could feed their prisoners, it was that they chose to, that they did so without hesitation, without cruelty, without the expectation of gratitude. A prisoner named Otto Eberhard, held at Camp Hearn in Texas, wrote in his journal, "We are given more food than we can eat, every day. The guards do not watch us closely when we take seconds. Some of the men have begun to gain weight. I think of my mother in Essen, and I wonder if she is still alive, and if she has eaten anything today. And I feel ashamed, not because I eat, but because I am alive and comfortable, and she is not." The food was not just sustenance, it was a message, a demonstration of capacity. In Nazi ideology, strength was measured by the ability to dominate, to subjugate, to extract resources from the weak.
But here was a different kind of strength, one that could afford to feed its enemies, that could maintain its principles even in the midst of total war. It was a strength rooted not in scarcity, but in surplus, not in fear, but in confidence. And it was eroding the certainty of men who had been taught to believe that might made right.
December 1944, Camp Stark, New Hampshire. The snow fell heavy that winter, blanketing the camp in silence. The prisoners worked in the nearby forests, cutting timber for the war effort, their breath steaming in the cold air. At night, they gathered around cast-iron stoves in the barracks, playing cards, reading letters, listening to the radio. The war news was grim. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat on all fronts. The Soviets were closing in from the east, the Americans and British from the west. Berlin would fall. It was only a matter of time. A prisoner named Ernst Floater sat by the stove, a letter from his wife crumpled in his hand. She had written from Dresden. The city was still standing, she said, though refugees poured in daily from the east, fleeing the Red Army. She did not know how much longer they could hold out. She asked him if he was safe, if he was warm, if he was eating enough. He looked around the barracks. Warm, fed, safe. The irony was unbearable. The camp commander had recently instituted a re-education program, a voluntary series of lectures and discussions designed to introduce the prisoners to democratic principles. Attendance was optional. Most of the hardline Nazis refused to participate, mocking those who did as traitors and weaklings. But others, like Floater, attended out of curiosity, or boredom, or the growing gnawing sense that they needed to understand what had happened to them. The lectures were led by German-speaking American officers and emigre professors, men who had fled the Third Reich in the 1930s. They spoke about the Weimar Republic, about the rise of fascism, about the choices that had been made, and the choices that could have been made differently. They did not preach, they did not condemn. They simply presented facts, documents, timelines. They asked questions. How did we get here? What did we believe, and why did we believe it? What do we believe now? Floater found himself unable to answer. He had been a soldier, he had followed orders, he had believed in his country, in his leaders, in the promise of a better world. And now, sitting in a warm barracks in New Hampshire, surrounded by abundance he could not reconcile with the propaganda he had consumed, he realized that he did not know what he believed anymore. One of the lecturers, a professor named Dr. Wilhelm Solman, a former Reichstag member who had been beaten by the SA and driven into exile, spoke one evening about the concept of Rechtsstaat, the rule of law. He explained that in a true democracy, laws applied equally to all citizens, that no one, not even the leader, was above the law, that justice was not a tool of the state but a principle independent of power. Floater raised his hand. But what if the people choose a leader who breaks the law? What if they vote for him willingly? Solman paused. Then he said simply, then the people must learn to choose differently. That is the burden of freedom. It is not easy, it is not safe, but it is the only way to remain human. The room was silent. Outside, the snow continued to fall.
By the spring of 1945, the rumors had begun to spread. The war in Europe was ending. The prisoners would be repatriated, sent home, back to Germany. For some, the news brought relief. The war was over. They would see their families again. They would rebuild. But for others, the prospect of return filled them with dread, because home no longer existed. The letters from Germany told a story of devastation beyond comprehension. Cities erased, infrastructure collapsed, starvation widespread, and the Soviet occupation in the East, tales of brutality, of reprisal, of a vengeance that knew no bounds. The prisoners held in American camps knew they were among the lucky ones. They had spent the war in relative comfort. They had not been bombed, they had not been starved, they had not been subjected to the kind of treatment that German camps had inflicted on Soviet POWs, men who died by the hundreds of thousands from exposure, disease, and deliberate neglect. But now they were being told that they would not all be sent back to the American zone, that many of them would be transferred to British or French custody, and most terrifying of all, that some would be handed over to the Soviets. The laughter that had greeted their arrival had long since vanished. Now there was only fear.
At Camp Rustin, Klaus Hartmann sat in the mess hall, staring at his plate. He had put on 20 pounds since his arrival. His face had filled out. His hands, which had been cracked and scarred from months in the field, had softened. He had written to his sister every week, though he had no idea if the letters were reaching her. The last he had heard, Hamburg was in ruins. A guard approached his table. Hartmann tensed. The guard, a young corporal from Ohio, set down a cup of coffee and sat across from him. "You hear the news?" the guard asked. His German was halting, learned from phrasebooks. Hartmann nodded. "You scared?" Hartmann considered the question. Then he said in careful English, "I do not want to go east." The guard frowned. "East? You mean the Russians?" "Yes. If I am sent to the Russians, I will not come home." The guard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll ask.
I don't know if it'll help, but I'll ask." Hartman did not know what to say. He had spent years being taught that the Americans were his enemies, that they were weak, degenerate, unworthy of respect. And here was a man, a farm boy from Ohio, barely old enough to shave, offering to intercede on his behalf, not because he owed him anything, not because they were friends, but simply because it was the right thing to do. That night, Hartman lay in his bunk and wept.
The transfers began in the summer of 1945. Tens of thousands of German POWs were loaded onto ships and sent back across the Atlantic. Most were sent to the American, British, or French zones of occupation, but some, particularly those identified as members of the SS or high-ranking Wehrmacht officers, were turned over to the Soviet Union. The stories that came back were horrific. Men sent to labor camps in Siberia, men who vanished without a trace, men who returned years later as shells of themselves. The American authorities, bound by the terms of the Yalta Agreement, had little choice. But the prisoners who remained in the camps heard the stories, and they understood what it meant. There were petitions, letters, desperate pleas to remain in American custody, to be sent anywhere but east. Some prisoners, facing transfer to the Soviets, attempted suicide. Others begged their guards for help, for intervention, for any mercy that could be offered. And some, quietly, began to beg not to be sent home at all.
August 1946, Camp Stark, New Hampshire. Ernst Floater stood at the fence, watching the road that led out of the camp. The war had been over for more than a year. Most of the prisoners had been repatriated. The camp was half empty now, a ghost of what it had been. He had been told that his turn would come soon, that he would be sent back to Germany, to the British zone, to whatever remained of his life. He did not want to go. He had received a letter from his wife. She was alive, barely. She had survived the bombing of Dresden, though the city had been reduced to ash. She was living in a cellar with their 2 children, scrounging for food, burning furniture to stay warm. She begged him to come home, to help her rebuild. But Floater could not shake the feeling that he was leaving one kind of prison for another, that the Germany he had fought for no longer existed, that the world he had known had been burned away, and what remained was something he did not recognize. The guard on duty that evening was a man named Sergeant Miller, a soft-spoken father of 3 from Pennsylvania. Floater had worked alongside him in the camp workshops, repairing furniture for the local school. They had developed an easy camaraderie, built on mutual respect and the shared rhythm of labor. Floater approached him. "Sergeant Miller, may I ask you something?" Miller looked up. "Sure, Ernst, what's on your mind?" "If you were me, if you had seen what I have seen, would you go back?" Miller was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know, Ernst. I think I'd have to, for my family, but I don't know if I'd want to." Floater nodded. He understood. There was no good answer, only the weight of choice and the burden of consequence. That night he packed his few belongings. The next morning he boarded the train that would take him to the coast, to the ship, to the long journey home. He did not back at the camp. He could not. In the years after the war, as Germany rebuilt and the Cold War solidified the division of Europe, the stories of German POWs in the United States became a footnote, a curiosity, a minor chapter in the vast history of the Second World War. But for the men who lived through it, the experience was transformative in ways that defied easy summary. They had arrived as soldiers of the Third Reich, believers in a vision of the world built on domination and hierarchy. They had expected brutality and found instead a system that treated them as human beings. They had been fed when they expected to starve. They had been given work when they expected exploitation. They had been shown a vision of society that did not require terror to sustain itself. And in the quiet moments, in the barracks after dark, in the letters they sent home, in the conversations they had with guards and farmers and strangers, they began to understand that they had been lied to, not just about the war, but about the world, about what it meant to be strong, about what it meant to be free. Not all of them changed. Some returned to Germany and rebuilt their lives without ever questioning the ideology they had carried into battle. Some clung to the mythology of the Third Reich, rejecting the evidence of their own eyes. But others, men like Klaus Hartmann, like Friedrich Bauer, like Ernst Floater, carried with them a quiet realization that would shape the rest of their lives. They had laughed when they arrived, because they did not understand, and they had wept when they left, because they did.
The barbed wire came down. The barracks were dismantled. The camps were returned to farmland, to forests, to the quiet normalcy of a nation at peace. The German prisoners went home, and America moved on. But the lesson remained, etched into the soil of 1,000 forgotten fields. Strength is not measured by the suffering you can inflict. It is measured by the humanity you can sustain, even in the face of those who sought to destroy you. Democracy is not a weakness. Abundance is not decadence. And the choice to treat your enemies with dignity is not mercy. It is power. The men who laughed at America's camps learned that truth the hard way. And when they begged not to be sent back east, when they clung to the fences and pleaded for one more day, one more week, one more month in the land of their captors, they were acknowledging something that no propaganda, no ideology, no amount of indoctrination could erase. They had seen the future, and it did not belong to the world they had fought to build. It belonged to the world that had fed them, housed them, and sent them home. That was the victory that mattered, not the battles won or the territory taken, but the quiet, unremarkable demonstration that a free society, even in the midst of total war, could afford to be humane. And in the end, that was the most devastating weapon of all.